All right. Well, hi, hello, and welcome to Data Security at Scale, Cyber Resilience for your Amazon S3 data. Now, today's exciting webinar is sponsored by Rubrik and AWS and produced by Actual Tech Media. If I haven't met you before, my name is Jess Steinbuck. I'm with Actual Tech Media, and I am so excited that I get to be your moderator for this conversation because, yes, we are going to talk about data and all the wonderful and magical business opportunities that data-driven decisions and processes are enabling across industries. We're going to talk about the importance of secure and efficient data storage, but our expert speakers are also going to talk to us about peace of mind, about that magical moment, maybe a few weeks from now, maybe a few months from now, when you get to close your laptop, pick up a suitcase, and go on vacation, like a real vacation. You're not even going to check your emails. You're not going to check your phone. You're not waiting for that midnight or 2 a.m. ping. And the reason that you will be able to do that, the reason that you will get all that relaxation is because you will know with absolute certainty that your data is protected, that you are prepared, you are resilient, and you can count on that effective recovery for your Amazon S3 data. And I got to tell you, on this gross and snowy and gloomy gray day, I am thinking about packing up and heading out to a beach somewhere. I see some of you chiming in from Namibia and LA. I see some beautiful sunny places, so maybe you can't relate. But hey, I think we could all use a little more peace of mind, a little more relaxation in our lives. And our awesome experts here with us today from Rubrik are going to tell you how they can get you from stressing about RTO and RPO to planning your PTO. All right, I stole that from the Rubrik team, but I thought that was a pretty good line, so I had to use it. And that is what we're going to get into today. I cannot wait. I'm going to bring our expert speakers on out here with me in just a moment, but I want to get through a few housekeeping things, and then we will get this show on the road. Let's start with our usual little guided tour of your audience console. We want to make sure that you know where everything is set today. All right, so we're going to start with the questions window. If you haven't found that, it's right next to the handouts tab. Click into that questions window right now. This is the best place to get involved and get interactive. Our speakers are going to be taking questions. They're watching this chat throughout, so they want to hear from you. Get those insightful questions, get those comments, get all your feedback in. Tell us about your vacation ideas. Where are you headed? You going to a beach? You going to someplace in Europe? What do you have in mind? Whatever it is, let us know. We want to hear from you. And all of that happens inside that handy dandy questions window in that audience console. So if you haven't already done that, give a little hi, hello, give us a wave. Tell us how your day is going. Tell us where you want to go on vacation. We want to hear from you. Get that in there. A quick side note that the questions window is also going to be the best place to reach out to the Actual Tech Media team today. So if you're having any technical issues, with a slide or sounds, audio, video, anything like that, I first want to remind you that a browser refresh is going to clear out any of the usual tech gremlins. But if they really have a hold of you today, I get it. If someone fed them after midnight last night and they're really causing problems, no problem. Just shoot us a message in the questions window and the Actual Tech Media team will be there to help you out. The last thing I'm going to point out, I mentioned it earlier, right next to that questions tab is the handouts tab. So if you can head into that handouts tab and make sure that you've got all those resources, open the tabs, download those, get everything saved for later, because there's some great follow-ups to the conversation that we're going to have with our experts today, and you are going to want to come back to those. So make sure you've spent some time with that handouts tab. And it is not just awesome content that we are giving away in our webinar today. We also have a $250 Amazon gift card as a prize drawing at the end of our webinar. Of course, you do need to be here in live attendance in order to win that prize, and you do need to meet all of the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. If you are not sure what those are, no problem. We have the full T's and C's listed for you in that handouts tab. So just head on over, scroll down to the bottom, and you'll find those T's and C's waiting for you there. All right, well, that is almost it for all of our housekeeping. The last thing we have for you is another prize giveaway, so that's a pretty cool thing. We have a $50 Amazon gift card that we will be giving away to the best question asked throughout our webinar today. So Jason and Bill, our speakers, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment, we will be going through all of the questions asked after we wrap up this webinar, which means that even if you ask a question and we don't have time to get to it during our session, you are still entered to win. So $50 Amazon gift card going to the best question asked. Make sure you get those questions in, because hey, you get a gold star from me and there's a chance that you're going to win that $50 Amazon gift card. All right, well, that is it for all of the housekeeping we needed to cover. I think it's time that we get our incredible experts on out here with us today and get this conversation rolling. We have one heck of a dynamic duo here with us us. That is Bill Gerling, Manager, Tech GTM at Rubrik, and Jason Cook, AVP, Worldwide Partner Sales Engineering at Rubrik. Bill and Jason, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm very excited to get into this conversation with you both.
Happy to be here.
Our pleasure. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Well, to kick things off, we had a bit of a question for the audience here. So we're going to let our experts speak in just a moment. But to start, homework for all of you. What you're going to do is click on the screen right now and let us know, what is your top cloud priority in 2024? What is number one on your list? And Jason, do you want to give us any further context to this, or what's your prediction for what we're going to see?
I'm going to bet security is top of the list. And then I'm going to bet the lagging trailer, but second most, will be cost reduction. I think probably third is scale, and speed is probably the last. Bill, what do you think?
Not a lot of speed racers.
Yeah.
Bill, what's your prediction? You're seconding Jason's?
Yeah, I'm seconding Jason's. Especially the topic of the webinar likely influences the responses here a little bit, right? We're pulling security conscious attention to begin with.
Yeah, I think we goosed it a bit, but so far it seems to be trending in that direction.
I like it.
It's also I think in order of relative difficulty. I mean, doing security and doing it well, particularly of data as it grows, is a challenge. And so I think, from a top of mind, at least from my point of view, it almost always gravitates towards the things that are hardest most, because you feel like that's your biggest challenge. So that's the thing you want to solve for first and foremost.
Boy, that's interesting. I wonder if there's a psychological test on whether or not we would gravitate towards the things that are hardest or the things that are easiest, and what that says about us. I don't know an answer to that, but I do have some answers for you. All right. So here are the results for all of you.
Nailed it.
Yes, Jason, Bill, any gut reaction to this? This is what you predicted.
100%. Makes perfect sense. Yeah, well, we want better security of the data. We want storing data, particularly in the cloud, to cost less, right? Because I think Bill and I would both agree that that's one of the primary barriers to further investment in the public cloud, has been the perception that, yes, it's flexible, it's agile, it's easy to use, relatively speaking, but difficult to secure because it has a bunch of different paradigms and nomenclatures that are different than traditional on-premises infrastructure and operations. And then number two, actually, if not done well or smartly, it can be more expensive. And so I think a lot of, certainly our perspective has been, from our customers and just the market in general, is hey, we tried cloud and it turned out we got the bill, and then we had to pivot. So
you know what, Jason, you just hit the nail on the head. One of our audience members here, Ali, wrote, actually, security is cost reduction. And I think that's a great point. And then immediately followed by Vinay wondering if Rubrik is going to be able to save him money so that he can afford to go on vacation.
Yes.
And I think that you're going to give us an answer to that.
Yeah, that's a resounding yes, Vinay. 100%.
Fantastic.
I'm all about empowering vacations. Right?
Well, that is a perfect way to kick things off. I want to know how you're going to empower my vacation. I'm sure the audience does as well. So Jason, I'm going to step back. I'll hand things right over to you. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jess. I really, really appreciate it. And everybody in the audience, wherever you may be, thank you so much for attending our webinar. I know Bill and I, it's not lost on us that, in a world of choice, of which there are many webinars and things to do in a particular day, particularly your work function or whatever it is that you need to get done on your own time. You don't have to come to this is basically where I'm going. So thank you so much for spending the time with us. We really appreciate it. From kind of a cursory overview perspective, for those that are not familiar with Rubrik, right, or maybe you've heard of us, but not exactly sure, what does that company do? Rubrik is a data security company who is keenly focused on helping customers not only recover and respond to cyber threats like ransomware, but also to provide security analytics at the point of data, right? We do that predominantly by taking backup copies of your data wherever it happens to live, and then layering on a rich set of analytics tools, which are largely aimed at both discovering as well as reporting, and then in some cases actioning the overall security posture of the data itself. Our primary portfolio, at least nomenclature, is called Rubrik Security Cloud, and there are a variety of capabilities that flow within that. It is essentially a SaaS-based management platform. Everything is co-located. It's one place to do all of your data protection, as well as I said, security analytics, data observability, as well as mass recovery during the times that you need. So we thought it would be a good idea to set up a little context for the discussion today, and that is, what essentially is really driving the market landscape as we see it today. A little bit of context in terms of some metrics, right? Because I think the first thing in terms of like how is Rubrik going to approach the solution to the problem first starts with an identification of the problem. And then we all have to collectively agree that it's a problem that's indeed worth solving. I think what's very interesting, Bill and I were discussing this earlier, is that all of these things that we'll be talking about in terms of what's happening with the overwhelming or the overall estate of cloud data management is that attacks and, breaches, and whether they be material or immaterial, are happening. I mean, it's public record, right? So it's not anything that I think we really need to spend a lot of time, debating. But I do think really culling this down and then making it clear as to what's happening in regards to both adoption as well as, overall scale, and then the problems or the challenges that are confronted as a part of that, I think are important, right? And if you look at S3 adoption overall, obviously it's scaling and growing wildly, right? Now, these data repositories, which were probably most often, places where it was, cheap and deep, scratch repositories, nothing that may have been deemed sensitive or critical, that really has shifted. And now S3 has become a place where really important and sensitive material as it relates to a company or an organization's information and digital estate is being stored, right? And so it's also a service that an overwhelming amount of Amazon users are using, roughly 1.2 million of them by today's count. So it's here to stay, and it's becoming ever more critically important, particularly in terms of the data it houses. So it's begetting this challenge, which is this is a data set that otherwise wouldn't have needed to have been protected, right, or backed up, right, in the past, but now clearly that's changing, and now there's a requirement to. Bill, any thoughts on kind of the overall point of view as it relates to what's happening in this space right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big inflection point, like folks have always tried to adopt a best practices based approach to provisioning services that house data, be it sensitive or unsensitive. I think that what has really been a needle mover lately is the fact that there are targeted attacks against this platform and against these data sets each and every day, it seems like, as of late. You go on the repo that lists some of the events that have happened recently, an amalgamation of information from CrowdStrike and from Mandiant and other industry reports. And what we find is that we find folks purposefully targeting S3. They're typically using leaked access keys or the like to access the data. And they're immediately trying to pivot and move horizontally across the S3 estate to exfiltrate and delete data. And so while some controls have existed, I think a purpose-built framework for securing these data sets against specifically ransomware is something that is a more recent development, certainly not net new, and that's shown by third-party incident responders, reporting on this activity. It's shown by sessions at Reinforce, where they talk specifically about ransomware resiliency for S3. It is shown in again, in this amalgamation of threat vectors and attacks that have occurred specific to the cloud recently. So the scale point here just goes to show that while those attacks are happening, the magnitude of their impact is absolutely massive when these data sets are impacted.
Right. Couldn't agree more. And I think some part of that is because of sort of the complex and also just generally massive nature of what the cloud, particularly Amazon Web Services, actually has to offer. There are so many things, even in a relatively small subscription, depending on the size of the organization or how they might be using those services, that is contained within that particular subscription. You have primary computing services, VMs, you have database as a service, you have S3 repositories. There are so many things, places where sensitive information or critical information can be stored. And to your earlier point, Bill, in a variety of different sort of containers or structures, whether it be fully structured, semi-structured, completely unstructured. And each of those things have their own, management and monitoring paradigms, but as well as protection paradigms. And I think to your point, there's been kind of a gap on not only introducing or sort of requiring that data be protected, but also how in the world would we do that? Is there an easy to consume tool set that will allow us to do that? And then co-locate all of that information that we're protecting centrally so that we might be able to analyze it for security posture. And I think that's another thing that we're seeing too, is this convergence of infrastructure and cloud architecture and operations related groups sort of intersecting with information security and GRC. And the reason is because everybody now basically has to look at things through a security lens. I mean, I think in order to properly fight cybercrime as an organization, you kind of have to democratize security analytics and just how about you would go to ensure that, from a permissions management perspective, from an authentication management perspective, as well as an overall security posture analysis, that we're doing all the right things to really see what our risk is. And I think the other thing too is it's a pervasive issue that's top of mind for a variety of stakeholders, whether it be the board, whether it be C-suite, whether it be practitioners, customers, you name it. Everybody is thinking about this. And I think a lot of it has to do with kind of the blessing and the curse of cloud. It's very easy to consume and deploy services, but yet it's so hard to get a handle on, particularly at scale, because it proliferates so quickly and very often unbeknownst to the very people who are in charge of taking care of it. Bill, any thoughts here?
I mean, you nailed it, man. The democratization of data has led to a sprawl that is unlike anything that we've ever seen before, right? You go back in the day, I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but vSphere came out and it was like, holy crap, VM sprawl. Anybody can spin up a server and they can do whatever they want with it now. And I've got to worry about overwhelming, the allocated storage and compute resources that I have with things that I don't need and yada, yada, yada. Well, now put a public facing API on the front of it, provide almost limitless scale. And it's not just VMs, it's IaaS services, PaaS services, SaaS services, all kinds of flavors sort of in between those things that are sort of at the application owner's fingertips. And you want to allow them to use these things because these are the capabilities that the cloud brings to the market in order to enable rapid iteration and deployment at scale, et cetera, et cetera. And so we need to find a way to not get in the way of the innovation engine, but still achieve the business goals from a resilience and cost perspective. Yeah,
we can't be, particularly in IT, who in a sense, I feel at least in the past, maybe less so today, but is kind of internal IT is kind of competing with the cloud in a sense, right? There's an agility and there's a rapidness of deployment and there's a perceived easiness of cloud that internal IT teams sometimes aren't associated with, right? Because of processes and security controls and all of those things. And I think you're dead on. You can't take the goodness or the cloudness, away from the cloud. You have to enable that. But of course, you still have the requirement to secure your data and of course, be able to recover it in your time of need. Bill, would you mind walking us through kind of a little bit about an anatomy of a typical data breach and what some of the things we see?
Yeah, absolutely. This is admittedly a high-level diagram. If I've got incident responders or people in a SOC sitting on the webinar today, they're going to say, oh, overgeneralized. But let's just talk about at a high level, especially relevant to S3, the patterns that we see when an attack occurs. And then we're going to extrapolate from there throughout the presentation. And we're going to talk about sort of each phase of this process and what sort of tools and procedures you can put in place in order to make sure that these threat actors can't have a material impact on your data sets. So where does it begin? Well, it begins with a bad guy. Bad guys always have red icons and typically have skull logos. So there he is. this bad guy is going to gain access to your environment. Generally, as you'll see on the next slide, that is through compromised credentials. And the incident reports support this quite well. Generally, you're going to have something like a leaked set of access keys, and those access keys are then going to be used to call the API or jump on the command line or log into the console and begin rooting around in the environment looking for valuable things. From there, they're going to do everything they can to get at as many resources as they possibly can. So that may mean elevating permissions. If you look at one of the other clouds, there was a recent exploit with the storage account keys that could then be used to pivot into like a managed identity and spread across the environment there, right? You look at the Okta breach previously, which was a terrible thing and impacted so many people. And that was like the identity source. And so as soon as they got a user that they could then use to exploit a vulnerability, the priority one was immediately expanding access in the footprint. At this point, data exfiltration is likely to occur, especially when it comes to S3. And this is honestly true even for more traditional ransomware attacks on premises these days. The bad guys have figured out that a lot of folks have solutions in place that allow them to recover their data and bring operations back online without paying the ransom. The industry has figured out that when you pay the ransom, even if you get a tool, sometimes you get a tool that's not optimized for recovery at scale. Imagine that. The bad guys don't invest in performance for their recovery tools. And so so they know, right? Recovery playbooks are in place, immutable copies are in place, et cetera. If I steal the data, I can then use that as an additional lever. And from there, we still encrypt, we still destroy, right? We're going to scorched earth on the way out, especially when it comes to the cloud and when it comes to S3. The most common pattern is really theft and then data destruction. The days of like encrypting a file system and selling the encryption keys back, they're largely in the rearview mirror. It still happens, but it's not reliable for the attackers, and they're well-run businesses, right? I mean, so they're out to make money, and the exfiltration play is the way to do it. And why it becomes risky is because what we find in our customers' environments oftentimes is that they don't know their data very well at all. And it's very, very easy in one of these environments to take some sensitive data from a production system in point A and move it to a non-production system or a less sensitive system at point B. And while customers and operators tend to not be great at discovering this data and ensuring that it's aligned with best practices, the attackers get paid every time they find something that someone's left behind. And so they're quite good at it. Even in a non-privileged system, you're likely to find something like a database dump or some other similar thing that houses sensitive data that shouldn't be there. And once they've got a copy, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. They're going to exfiltrate that data, and they're going to use it against you. Again, just drilling one level deeper into each of the phases here. That first phase, a lot of folks tell me, I have MFA everywhere. I have an effort to constantly reduce privileges. I have all of my stuff with public access turned off, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, if credentials from a privileged user leak, there's a high likelihood they're going to be used against you. If you've got enforce MFA everywhere, there's going to be a time when a service account or something gets created that doesn't have MFA enforced because some system or process in place doesn't support it. Like relying on I have strong walls only and I'm never going to get attacked is not a safe bet. And we see this in the industry reports. Like if you go crawl and you just look for compromises that have affected AWS users, what you will find is access keys leaked, access keys leaked, access keys leaked, access keys leaked. They're in an environment variable and a system got compromised and I pulled it out of the environment variable. They're embedded in a script and they're stuck in a GitHub repository. Even if a CVE is used, I compromise a system through the CVE, I retrieve temporary access keys through the role associated with that instance, I use those access keys to go do things. So the first thing to be cognizant of as we sort of talk about patterns and best practices is that we like to say the bad guys aren't breaking in, they're logging in. Almost always it is a credential compromise through either a phish or some sort of leakage that leads to the initial access to the environment. Cookie, any comments here before I proceed?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with really expounding on, or at least documenting and sharing the reality of the nature of breaches today. I think you touched on a couple of things. One is that it turns out criminals would prefer to work smarter, not harder. I mean, it's maybe why they got into crime in the first place. You know, doing it the legal way is tougher, right? Takes more effort. And so I think from that perspective, to your point earlier, Bill, exfiltration has become the name of the game because you can get to revenue much faster. You know, if you think the time to ransom and thereby the time to monetizing a breach, whether it's material or immaterial, I think then becomes the next question because that determines whether or not an organization is going to pay. If the answer is yes, exfiltration is absolutely the way to go. And I think the challenge that I've heard a lot is, number one, yes, there's the scalability of it. Data keeps growing and proliferating. And to your point about the cloud, it just gets easier over time because there's so many simple mechanisms for doing it. But then it's also the classification of said data is like, how do I know what I have as well as what operational processes and procedures do I allow? Because to your point, like one of the most silly yet common things is DBA creates dump of database with sensitive material, puts it into an S3 bucket, unbeknownst to him or her, it has full access or read controls to a variety of different constituents. To your point, there's an authentication breach of privileged credentials. There's a siphoning of that database. Oh, and what do you know? It's got a bunch of PII and sensitive material in it. What otherwise would have been a benign operations thing that a particular operator did turns into a breach somewhere down the line. So it's how do I know that's occurring and how do I know that's happening? And then of my data estate, do I have some way to analyze where I might have those particular exposures? So I think I totally agree with you on there's getting a handle on that piece of it. And then the next thing is you're exactly right. Almost all the notable breaches were some kind of social engineering on a privileged user. Like the one from MGM was interesting. They socially engineered an attack on a privileged user and then got the help desk to reset their MFA token, and then away they went. And I don't know how you deal with traffic and that is privileged. That looks like normal traffic. I mean, all the best scanners and perimeter tools and intrusion detection systems in the world are not designed to deal with traffic that is normal, that appears normal or is properly authenticated. So I couldn't agree with you more.
Let's take a look at the recon and lateral movement patterns specific to S3 here, and I'm just going to do a full build out. Okay, so now we're going S3 specific, and we're going to talk about once a threat actor has entered the environment and has the ability to do some S3LS type stuff amongst other actions, what types of actions are they going to take within your environment in order to be able to iterate out the environment, fetch data, and execute destructive actions? So obviously all the way to the left in this slide is the initial authentication as some sort of legitimate user that has access to the environment. The next thing that is going to happen is we're going to see probably a whole slew of list buckets API calls. This is essentially, if you're unfamiliar with S3, which would be strange for you to be here, right? But this is essentially an API call that that iterates out all the buckets within a single account. And if we've got a user who can assume roles in such compromise, what you will likely see is that user first listing all the buckets in the initial entry account and then assuming roles into every account that they can gain access to in order to iterate out all of the buckets. From there, they're going to evaluate access based upon their context. And there's a sneaky way to do this specifically to S3 that triggers less sort of alarms in the environment and still allows them to ascertain whether or not they've got access. And that's the head bucket or the head object API call. So what the head object API call allows them to do is it allows them to retrieve an object's metadata without having to retrieve the whole object. And so this is a less noisy way to say, hey, do I have access to some object in this bucket? And you can go head and object throughout sort of the key space in a single bucket. You can go head object, a single object in each bucket. It's a very low impact sort of tiptoe way of probing for whether or not you've got the access to read data out of individual buckets. And then from there, I want to inspect the data, right? So I need to grab a copy of the data. What am I going to do? Very simple. Get object returns the required object from the specified bucket. You can download it to an endpoint. You can download it via an API. You can use, there's SDK, like pretty much every single programmatic or UI-driven mechanism for interacting with AWS allows you to fetch an object from S3. So some of this stuff probably seems obvious, but I want you to think of this in the context of an attack, which is probably happening at scale and is happening through what we assume at this point is a legitimate user. What you will see as we progress through the presentation is that each of these operations, while normal in and of themselves, within an environment at a particular scale against a certain subset of the data is normal. But when you start to see diversion from sort of typical patterns, typical activities, and typical scope for these sorts of API calls, this is when you have at least an inclination that someone might be conducting reconnaissance in the environment. And what does it look like in the AWS platform? Well, it looks like a bunch of API calls on CloudTrail or in the server access logs or whatever. So we're beginning to hone in on the fact that we need to watch this type of activity and maybe take action if stuff looks anomalous, even if the raw API calls themselves are often normal.
Right, because it may not be benign. It may be indicative of, to your point, reconnaissance or lateral movement by a threat actor.
Yep, exactly. Okay, playing on that same theme, the next step is the data exfiltration and the data destruction. So exfiltration we sort of touched on when we were on the evaluate for sensitive data step. Exfiltration just looks like, get object or copy object at scale. So I'm going to grab as much of the data as I can. S3 is quite good at parallelism and at operations at scale. So retrieving the data from S3 that's what the service was kind of built to do. So it's a fairly trivial operation for someone that wants to fetch a bunch of data. Encrypting is also possible and a less common pattern for attacks against S3, but you can put an object with an attacker-owned KMS key that the source account doesn't have access to that would sort of achieve the desired outcome. You could also use one of the SDKs, grab an object, encrypt it client-side, put it back. By the way, all of this get object activity is causing, data transaction fees and potentially data egress fees in the customer's environment while it's ongoing. But yeah, encryption is possible, but less common for attacks against S3. The most frequent mechanism that we see for destruction is, again, the standard S3 APIs, right? Either delete object, delete buckets. The lifecycle policy one is another akin to the head object approach. The lifecycle policy approach is pretty nasty because a lot of customers will only use CloudTrail for their environment, and they won't turn on the server access logs for everything because they are formatted differently and they lag a little bit, and they don't provide all the same outputs as CloudTrail, nor does CloudTrail provide all the same outputs as the server access logs. But the one place the server access logs are particularly useful is this lifecycle transition thing. So you can put lifecycle policies on the buckets, right? And you can say after some duration of time has elapsed, move the object to a cheaper storage class or delete it entirely. Well, CloudTrail doesn't catch lifecycle policy data transitions. And so you can go build a lifecycle policy that deletes all the data. You'll see the lifecycle policy create in CloudTrail and you'll see the application of it and such. But what you won't see is all your data getting deleted. That you can see in the server access logs, but not in CloudTrail. And so this is where we're seeing the forest through the trees or the trees through the forest or whatever is a good idea, right? Looking at the microcosm of activities that occur during an attack, because there are very specific things you want to key in on that might be indicative of something happening in the environment. And if you make assumptions about the tooling or about visibility through one particular process, you may end up missing something like this lifecycle policy transition approach to expiring data. Okay, let's keep driving on. Cookie, you want to take this one? I'll build it out for you. Just to begin to talk a little bit about an incident versus a breach here.
You bet. So, I think from our general perspective as it relates to the differences, right? Cyber incidents are going to occur with an incredible amount of frequency on a daily, if not by second basis. I mean, there's an overwhelming amount of them that occur. And very often, preventative measures that are taken will stop them in their tracks, right? It's certainly not what we're saying is that prevention is a waste of time. No. But what we are saying is that every once in a while, right, the attackers win, right? And that really is the key difference, right? The incidents are the consistency or the constancy of attacks that will be launched against any given organization. A breach is actually something that is material. Material is deemed by a variety of different constituents within an organization. Generally speaking, that will be some sort of coalition of governance, risk, and compliance, the C-suite, the board, legal, and communications, corporate communications. In terms of a real look at exactly what would mean a breach of customer or public trust, an impact to revenue, which if the company is publicly traded would need to be reported, et cetera, right? And so there has to be a very keen sense of those differences, because ultimately they beget the different approaches that you might take to dealing with one or the other. So for example, with incidents or the overwhelming amount of attacks that are coming in, obviously there's prevention mechanisms and then also being ready to respond if in the event that one goes through, which is the breach aspect. So that I think manifests in two ways. One is having a handle on what your overall data security posture looks like and what your real risk is, and being very astute about what that is. And then, of course, having a mechanism to determine what indeed is material versus immaterial. And then, of course, last but not least, to be able to recover, to be able to resume services quickly and efficiently, right? I think in the orders of priority, that obviously is the biggest one, because if you look at any given incident response, an IR could take a very long time given how much forensic data or forensic activity may have to go on. But if you look at recovery should be the key first step inside of an incident response, meaning I can get applications and services, at least for key stakeholders, up and running and working and production and revenue moving while I do my forensics in the background. So from that perspective, that's really the difference and the thing that we like to call out, because you organizationally have to be prepared for either or. This is definitely something that we're talking about a lot because ultimately bolstering your cyber resiliency and your cyber recovery capabilities, irrespective of the environment, but in cloud and Amazon in particular, is really becoming or is a board level initiative, right? These are things that are akin to mitigating business risk, less so a technological issue that needs to be addressed with a better mousetrap or a better tool set. And a lot of that stems from some fundamental questions, which is, do we have a true handle on where the risk is inside of our digital estate, right? Whom or what has access to those things? That could be internal operators. It could be third parties, right? Supply side or supply chain attacks are a very real thing in today's threat landscape. How many layers of protection do we have? As Bill said, if I've got awesome outer walls, well, what happens if those walls are breached or someone gets around them or through them or over them? Is there yet another layer or an action that occurs after that point, perhaps to stop whatever that is? And then if all else fails, do I have a mechanism to recover and or to respond? This is something we're talking about time and time again. And then if you look at it from kind of a adjacency industry perspective, is that now more than ever, organizations and just the market overall is spending more on cybersecurity than they ever have on in the past, and certainly on even general IT. And I think to the outside of what we said at the beginning is that this democratization of cybersecurity across all of the different constituents within a given organization, I think is what's begetting this. Infrastructure teams are thinking about and are delivering or trying to deliver solutions that include security analytics and security mechanisms within them. And then last but not least, somebody made a point in the questions in the comments area about, but all the security and prevention and recovery mechanisms certainly come at a higher price. So thus is the next riddle is how do I deliver that in the most cost-effective way possible, right? So with that having been said, we've given you guys a lot of the sort of setup of the problem statement, the problem that I think we all agree is worth solving, and then certainly what's happening in the market that's really begetting the need to protect certain key assets, such as Amazon's S3. So with that, now we're going to transition into exactly how we would do that from a Rubrik perspective. What is our offering? What are the ways that, from a technology perspective, we're looking at it, and what is the solution that we're bringing to market as a result? So, Bill, from that perspective, thoughts on this piece here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, really, to achieve a proper resilience and recoverability posture for your S3 data, or for any data, anecdotally speaking, but in the context of S3 for the purposes of this discussion, there's 4 high-level objectives that have to be achieved. First of all, eliminating unnecessary data is critical, as sort of evidenced by the 2 previous slides that we just looked at. So it's got both the security and the cost angle to it. If you have redundant, stale, or duplicate data within your environment, it drives up cost because you pay to store that data by the drip in the cloud, especially in S3, right? But it also drives up cost because if you have a proper defense in depth and recoverability strategy in place, you're probably backing it up. And it increases risk because there's a high likelihood that some of that unnecessary data is unnecessary sensitive data. And that there's a high likelihood that if that data is either stale or duplicate and sensitive, that it's contained within a repository that doesn't have sufficient access control, that doesn't have sufficient logging, alerting, reporting capabilities configured against it, so on and so forth. So we think about our database dump example that we used a moment ago. This is a perfect example of unnecessary data that increases risk because we've dumped an asset that has sensitive data in it. We've stuck it inside of a storage service S3 that is metered by the gigabyte and by use. And we've likely done so in a test dev environment where maybe best practices are not always in place and enforced when it comes to security and posture. So number 1 is you got to know your data. You got to eliminate that unnecessary data to draw down cost and decrease risk. From there, you should have a data estate that consists predominantly of necessary data. And that necessary data needs to have least privileged access to it that is configured initially, but also periodically queried, remediated, enforced, whatever terminology that you want to use. That access component is kind of a component of the purple block, which is assessing posture, right? And so when I talk about posture, I mean, is logging enabled against the bucket? Is it server access logs? Is it CloudTrail? Or do we have CloudWatch configured for the bucket and for the region as well? Or are we only using one of those things? Is encryption at rest enforced? Are we tightly controlling the keys? Are we enabling features like versioning or like object lock where we should, right? All of these components, when appropriately used, greatly decrease the likelihood of a material impact during an incident or a breach scenario. And then lastly, once you've cleaned up the data state, limited access, got your posture in order, at that point, you need to watch your environment despite the fact that you've got best practices in place, because there is going to be the next Okta. There is going to be the next set of access keys that get leaked out in a repo, right? Like, these things happen. We're human beings and we operate at scale and often under pressure and duress. And so mistakes are going to happen, and you need to keep a bead on what activity has taken place in the environment. Is that activity from a legitimate user? Is that activity anomalous based on what that user typically does? And if so, what actions do I take? What playbook do I run to respond? So we'll go into each of these a little bit deeper, but I just wanted to like put up front, like, if you want to meet these recommendations from AWS and sort of the high level objectives that CISOs across the world are trying to achieve today, these 4 things are critical in terms of your S3 data. Cookie commentary before I drive on?
Nope. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think let's dive into what we're doing about it and, from a solution set standpoint, what we're offering.
Yeah, so absolutely. Eliminating unnecessary data. How do we achieve that practically for S3? Well, first, we need an inventory of the data containing assets globally. So throughout the whole organization or across organizations, if you've got multiple, you need to scan those assets for sensitive data, right? So this is beginning to build what we would call a data catalog. Once you've scanned those assets and their data, or the data therein, you need to understand that data. And that means unpacking things like database backups. It means reading semi-structured data. It means reading free-form text, fully unstructured data, in order to ascertain whether or not there's sensitive data in the asset. And if so, what category of sensitive data is it? What context was it found in? Is it in a backup? Is it in a CSV file? Is it in a self-hosted database type thing? Like, what is the context I found it in? And what is the legitimate use for that data? And at this point, we've got a data catalog. We can assess the data containing assets in our environment, and then we can archive off or delete unnecessary data. This is a place where Rubrik provides some unique value because we have the capability to build the data catalog, and we have the capability to archive off copies of the data cheap and deep, so that you can, delete the source copy, reduce that risk, reduce that cost, even if you're not 100% confident that it's an unnecessary copy of the data. From there, we've tidied up the data state. Now we need to make sure that we're limiting access to all of these data containing assets that now legitimately house sensitive data. And again, it starts with the visibility piece. You're going to see each of these steps tends to start with the visibility piece. So I need an inventory of all principals that have access to any data to begin with, right? In AWS, this is your users, your roles, your groups, your federated identities, so on and so forth. And then I need to look at which permissions those things have against, in this case, my S3 assets. Also tricky because S3 has identity and access management policies that can be bound directly to the service principal. There's service control policies that can be enforced from an upper echelon upon the account itself. There's ACLs, which most people aren't using, but still exist on S3 buckets today. And then there's bucket policies that allow you to take the buckets perspective in defining who and what can access it and under what conditions. And an individual principal's access level to some subset of your data is dictated by a coalescence of all of these different constructs and policies. And so parsing through all those things and determining the end result, like what access does some user or group have to my data, it can be pretty tricky because you've got to look for explicit denies. You've got to look all over the place for different policy documents and such. So a clean view of who has what access, and then a process to continuously audit and reduce that access to the minimum possible level is critically important. I saw a report today, 21% of organizations in the wild still have publicly exposed buckets with material data in them today, despite AWS's defaults and best practices that are well documented. By the way, I'm not saying AWS isn't doing their job. They've completely shifted the paradigm of their platform to say, hey, don't do this. People still find a way to do it.
Right.
So yeah, and then beyond that, just best practices around identity and access management in general. Don't use persistent static credentials. Favor temporary credentials instead. That's what the switch to roles gets you. Ensure that MFA is enforced. Find stale user accounts, just like you're finding stale data. Find stale roles, find stale groups, and remove them from the environment. They don't need to be there. Cookie, comments on identity and access management as we drive on here?
Critically important overall. And certainly, again, as we said at the outset, this is really what's driving the overwhelming amount of at least insertion points for threat actors. So this is kind of, in my mind, and I think in yours too, the low-hanging fruit of what we can do, organizationally, plus some of the things that really will be assumed or be part of the Rubrik solution offering to help address these particular concerns.
Yeah. And when it comes to the Rubrik solution offering, I've got about 5 minutes to get there and give you the blurb on what we're doing in the space and why it's valuable. So I'm going to burn through the last couple of low-level drill down slides here just so we can ensure to get that included in the session. Look, posture is critically important. And this is the proactive piece to securing your data, right? While we say thick walls aren't going to protect you in and of themselves, that doesn't mean that you don't lock the front door and you don't build a wall. And so here we're piggybacking on that access minimization theme, but we're also ensuring that logging, encryption, that cyber recovery is enabled, right? That we have backups turned on, that we've got things like object lock and things like MFA delete in place where appropriate. And so this just comes down to looking at those sensitive data containing assets and making sure that they follow platform best practices when it comes to configuration and posture. Beyond that, we assume we've got all the previous stuff in place, which is a bit of a Herculean effort to begin with. From there, we want to keep an eye on the estate, right? Just because you lock the front doors doesn't mean that you don't set the house alarm, that you don't have a smoke alarm. So even if we reinforce our posture and our stance, more generally speaking, we still need to keep an eye on those sensitive data containing assets. We need to keep a very close eye on anonymous and external access. And we need to look at patterns that are anomalous and respond to them quickly, right? So is someone in Russia, then they're in the US 30 seconds later using the same credentials? Or is someone who typically uses the UI all of a sudden using an SDK? Are we going from hundreds of interactions to thousands of interactions? So on and so forth. These can be warning signs that someone's in the environment doing something improper. And then beyond that, we want to ensure that we've got that break glass solution in place, and that even if despite our best efforts, someone enters the environments and does something gnarly, that we can quickly identify our last clean copy, that we can quickly recover that last clean copy guaranteed to the desired location, usually a clean room, a secondary account, whatever, and that we can do so in an efficient manner. And maybe that means granularly I'm getting one object back because I need that one thing right now. Maybe it means en masse I'm restoring whole hog to a totally different organization and bringing applications back online and all of that good stuff. This is super critical. And I know it's a component of posture to have like proper data protection in place, but this is your get out of jail free card when data gets deleted despite your best efforts. And so you need to know that those copies are in place. You need to know exactly when you have to go back to and what sort of playbook you're going to run to get there. Cookie, comments 100%. Before I drive on? Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think too, what we've talked about and seen a lot is that if you think about it from an IR perspective, it's not just that you have a recovery point, it's that you have a clean one. So it's sort of like the and. It's yes, I have recovery points, right, which I'm able to go back to, but the and of I'm able to analyze those particular recovery points for things that would indicate compromise or that would indicate some kind of exposure. So it's really the tying of the two things together. And from a Rubrik solution perspective, that's what we're really bringing to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've just got a couple minutes left here. So let me get into where Rubrik can help specifically. Look, we wanted this to be an informative educational session that gives you the ability to write a high-level playbook for how you secure your S3 estate, right? And honestly, you could begin to run that playbook independent of Rubrik if you wanted to. And we wanted this session to be valuable and informative in that context. But obviously, we have a solution in this space as well. And we feel like our solution is a very, very strong solution that tackles both the resilience and recoverability component of the stack, as well as the proactive posture data security element of the stack as well. With Rubrik Security Cloud, we give you the ability to automatically discover, classify, and categorize your sensitive data containing assets, including S3. What we do is we build a heat map in our platform of high-risk data. And the way that we ascertain whether or not that data is high risk is by running those discovery, classification, and contextualization workflows, and then by marrying that up with posture and user access. What this allows us to do is it allows us to bubble up the most at-risk assets in your environment so that you can take action on those first. With a pure play posture tool, you're not going to have the data context. With a pure play data resilience tool, you're not going to have the posture context. It's when you put these things together that all of a sudden you can see your biggest risks and you can address those first. Beyond that, yeah, absolutely, Cookie. Anything to add there before I jump on?
The tool set that I talked about at the outset, or our primary portfolio and offering Rubrik Security Cloud, also brings the benefits of consolidating everything into a common view, right? So we've talked a lot about S3 as the data source in this particular context, I think largely because it's a newer concept to protect it in the first place, and then of course to analyze it for risk posture. But there's also value in being able to centralize as many of these functions as you possibly can, and or consolidate what otherwise would be very specific silos of data protection, irrespective of where the data happens to be housed. I see this most often in public cloud, where there are a lot of native tool sets that you can leverage, but none of them really tie together, and it's difficult to manage that and or report or analyze on that centrally.
Yeah, absolutely. So beyond the data context and the posture piece, right, we've also got the ability to identify exfiltration activity. We're going to look at CloudTrail. We're going to look at the server access logs. We're going to look at a bunch of other sources. We're going to look at normal user behavior. We're going to look at current user activity, and we're going to trigger a data threat alert when anomalous stuff happens, right? So we've got the proactive and the reactive piece in the platform. Obviously, Rubrik's background is in resilience and in recoverability. So with regards to S3, we're talking hundreds of millions of objects secured through a declarative data protection policy model with automatic protection, immutable copies, granular recovery, en masse recovery, in-place recovery, out-of-place recovery, right? This is that break glass solution that I was talking to before. Critically important for S3 because the scale of S3, both from a capacity perspective, as well as the scale of S3 from a number of objects and amount of metadata you have to handle perspective, makes it a very difficult workload to come up with a solution for that operates at cloud scale. And we've seen this in the market with other solutions in the space where maybe they have a good approach, right? But if you can't do hundreds of billions of objects, you're going to fall down in the enterprise. The other place that solutions like this fall down is on the TCO front. So if the secondary copy of your data is as expensive or more expensive than the primary copy of your data, there's a good chance that you're not going to protect everything that you need to protect. A customer said to me the other day on a call, security is everyone's number one priority until they get the bill, right? The Palo Alto quotes from the previous slide sort of riff on that a little bit more. What we're going to offer you from the Rubrik side of things when it comes to S3 data protection is a solution that should reduce your overall TCO somewhere in the order of magnitude of 20 to 30% versus using platform standard tooling. And we're going to give you all this value add stuff on the top where we allow you to build that data catalog, where we allow you to respond quickly to misconfigurations and vulnerabilities, where we allow you to identify and respond to threat-like activity in your environment, and some differentiation in terms of the nuts and bolts of the data protection stuff. So doing things more granularly or supporting more targets in terms of recovery, you get all of that at a lower price point versus what you would likely assume that you might employ in this scenario. And then, we do it all utilizing a framework that has some philosophical elements of it that I think are super important, right? So we're not going to fetch data out of your environment. We're not going to require you to explicitly link data sources in or deploy agents, because how can you do that with data that you don't know exists? We're going to do it through automation so that it very quickly catalogs and protects your data. And we're going to do it with zero impact to performance because, again, what good is a solution that creates and secures data if it impacts your ability to use that data in a production sense? So we have squeezed out every second that we could from this session, and I'm getting the hook. So I'm going to wrap it. I just want to say thank you for hopping on. Cookie, any closing remarks before we hand it back to the team here?
First, Bill, as always, my friend, the ham and egg game is strong, my brother. Let's keep that. Let's keep that a tradition. I think the second thing is team. Thank you so much for putting your questions into the comment section. We will get a distillation of those as a takeaway, and we will make sure that we get all of those answered just as judiciously and expeditiously as possible. Thank you so much for coming and participating and listening. We are grateful and we appreciate it. Jess, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, and we're all so grateful on back to you. I do have to say the questions have been pouring in and they are excellent. The competition for the best question card is going to be very fierce. I do want to say, I know Bill and Jason, you guys were really adjusting the content as we went through and hitting a lot of these questions. So I think we were able to get a lot of answers out to folks. But there, as you said, there will be follow-up. There's one that I just want to call out before I let you guys go. And I know we're right at time here. But a few people were asking about the usability in the dashboard. Now, I happen to love Rubrik's user experience. I think it's gorgeous and so user-friendly. And I know that we had a demo plan today that we didn't have time to get to. So I'm wondering if maybe one of the great follow-up ideas for where folks in the audience could go next would be to book that follow-up demo. And is there any other sort of, place that you'd want to send them to follow up to get more information right away, Jason?
So a couple of things. I will say that our website is a fantastic resource for a variety of different things. If you just head on over to Rubrik.com and then you look at the solutions as well as the use cases areas, there's a variety of different information, white papers, case studies, A to Z as it relates to how we fit, how we apply, the types of solutions, reference architectures, et cetera. I think that's a fantastic resource. The other one I would mention is our YouTube channel. So there's a lot of practical demonstrations that you will find. Simply do a Google on Rubrik YouTube and/or search in the YouTube search bar for Rubrik, and you'll find our channel.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you. And Bill, I have to say you had a few one-liners that actually had me laughing out loud today. And I want to thank you for a lot of really entertaining and engaging content from both of you. I wish we could keep going. I hate that I have to be the Bo Peep hook here, but I will wrap things up. I hope that we get to chat with you both again soon. And thank you again for being here with us.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. And to all of you out there, again, thank you for some wonderful questions, really, really insightful conversations happening in the chat today. And I saw some articles getting shared back and forth. I love that. Again, as Jason mentioned right at the top here, there is a lot of ways that you could be spending your time today. And we're so grateful that you chose to spend so much of it here with us. And obviously, there's lots more to cover. So I hope that one of your first stops before you head out today is to visit that handouts tab. Remember that there's some great follow-ups and takeaways to the conversation that we just had. So make sure you click in, go through. There's a self-guided demo, there's solution briefs, there's all kinds of great things. And again, as much as we hope that we retain every piece of information that we got in this conversation, we're going to lose a little bit of it. So make sure you've got those handouts downloaded, save them, put them aside, and spend some time with them later today. You can also use that QR code on your screen right there and get a little bit more information as well. While you're doing all of that, I'm going to do our final prize giveaway. We have a $250 Amazon gift card going to Michael Kachmar from Ohio. Michael Kachmar of Ohio, congratulations to you. We will follow up with you after we wrap. We will also follow up with our best question gift card. So stay tuned for that. Again, the competition on that today is absolutely fierce. I'm trying to keep up with all the wonderful thank yous and high fives coming in from all of you. I see a lot of compliments to our speakers and to the content today, and I love that. I'm so glad that all of you got so much out of our conversation today. What a fun conversation that was. And again, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I have to once again thank Rubrik and AWS for making this webinar possible, especially to our incredible speakers here with us, Bill and Jason, for giving us a really authentic look at what makes you passionate and excited and why we should be passionate and excited about Rubrik. Not just because, as we talked about at the start, maybe this will enable some future vacations for everyone out there in the audience. Certainly that peace of mind is a great takeaway, but I think you've given us a lot of other really wonderful takeaways and things to consider as we go on about our days here. So to all of you out there, my biggest high five as always, and my biggest thank you goes to every one of you for joining, for being such active and wonderful participants in this conversation. This has been such a fun day. I can't wait till we all get to chat again soon. And until then, I hope you have an absolutely beautiful end to your day. Thanks all.